Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pei. Wishing everyone a Chag Sameach. It's a bit of a difficult, complicated time period, but wishing for Geula and for a calm holiday, quiet, and some sleep. And, B'sorot Tovot. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. I'll just remind everyone, all the Pesach dafim should be up. If for some reason you're having an issue and you don't see them, please let us know. There seem to be perhaps some glitches here and there. So if so, let us know immediately and we'll get it fixed. But all the Pesach dafim should be up all week, and I'll be sending out the links as usual, but you can also always just get to them from the site in case I send it a little bit later or something. Okay, let's get started. We saw in the Mishnah yesterday, we talked about 3 cases of Vlad, which is the offspring of an animal that was already designated to be a Toda, a Tmura, if I decide, I don't want this animal after I chose it, and I want to switch it to a different animal. I'm not allowed to do that. But if I do, they're both sanctified, and then they both have to be sacrificed. Also, the Vlad has to be sacrificed. And also a case where I had an animal, I lost the animal, I brought a different animal in its place, found the original animal, and then I choose one of them I bring, and the other one also needs to be sacrificed. So I have to sacrifice them both. So in all these cases, we sacrifice both animals, but as we learned at the end of yesterday's talk, but only one of them comes with bread, when it's the Vlad, so it's not the Vlad, the offspring doesn't come with bread, the Tmura doesn't come with bread, and in the case where I lost it, whichever one I bring second doesn't come with bread, because they're not the real Toda offering. Seems pretty intuitive. Now, there's a study guide for today, and I'm going to share it. It's going to pretty much help us with a lot of the daf organizing it. We'll start with Shalach Rav Chanina Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. 3 lines from the bottom of Ayin Tenem Bet. Rav Chanina sends in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela la'achar kapara. By the way, the fact that we say there's no bread brought with these extra offerings is only before, if you did it, after you already received atonement from the main animal. But if you bring it before you actually got the atonement for the original animal, then you need to bring it with bread. Now, this makes no sense, really, in most of the cases, and we're going to have to figure out exactly what cases he's referring to. Because, for example, the Tmura will never be brought with bread, and the Vlad, theoretically, should never be brought with bread. So what's the difference if you bring it before or you bring it after? And the Aveda case, well, we already learned what's supposed to be. If you bring the second one first, or whichever one you bring first goes with bread, whichever one you bring second doesn't. So, that's already explicitly stated in the Mishnah. So what's he talking about? In order to get to an answer, I'm going to actually have 4 different possibilities. And here I'm going to share my screen and start looking at the study guide. We're going to talk about chovot and nidavot. Okay, let's explain what a Toda Chova is and a Toda Nidava. A Toda is always a Nidava, you're supposed to bring it in certain circumstances, but in the end, it's a voluntary offering. But you could bring it in a way that actually obligates you. What does that mean? Well, there's 2 ways. We've learned this Neder Nidava. There's 2 ways you can bring a voluntary offering. You could say Hare Alai. That's called the Neder. That means I will bring upon myself a Toda. That means no matter what happens to the animal, I have to bring a new one in its place because I've taken upon myself what we call achrayut, responsibility. So that means the responsibility is on me. So if something happens to the animal, I have to replace it. That becomes an obligation in the end because I obligated myself. If I say harezo, this animal is going to be a Toda, then if something happens to the animal, I don't have to bring another animal because all I promised was this animal. The animal dies, the animal runs away, something happens to it, I don't have to bring another animal. So that is without achrayut. So now we're going to call it nidava, voluntary. So now we're going to try some options. We have basically now 6 options to try. But Tmura is, why do we have 6 options? Because we have a Toda that was a Chova and a Nidava, and we have 3 cases in our Mishnah. Either Chalife, which is the one that got lost and I brought a different one in its place. We have the Vlad and we have the Tmura. So there's 6 permutations because each one could be, it was for a Toda Nidava or a Toda Chova. But we're not going to get into Tmura because nobody would ever think that Tmura comes with bread. So we're going to do the other 4 possibilities and we're going to see as we go along, we're going to reject each one until we get to the last one, which is going to be the right answer. So Havi bar Rav Amram. Rav Amram asked the following question. Ahaya. To which case was Rav Chanina in the name of Rabbi Yochanan referring to when he said, this is only after you got atonement, but before atonement, you would have to bring bread. Ilem a chalife toda chova, if you're talking about the chalife of a toda of a chova, meaning I said alai, I have to bring another animal in instead, and I brought this other animal that was lost, right, in place of the lost one, and instead of when I found the first one, instead of bringing that one, I brought the second one. That would be lifnei kapara, and then it would come with bread. Well, that actually works. But what's the problem? Well, ilifnei kapara tanina. It already said so explicitly in the Mishnah. I don't need Rabbi Yochanan to tell me something that it says explicitly in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, if I bring the second one first, right, the one that I replaced it with, then obviously I bring that one with bread and I don't bring the next one with bread. And ila achar kapara, and if we're trying to, right, if it's after kapara, maybe that's the chiddush, that after kapara you don't bring it with bread. Well, tanina also, it also said that. If I bring the first one first and then the second one, of course I don't bring the second one with bread. All that was stated explicitly in the Mishnah. There's definitely no reason he needed to say that. Okay, so second option. Ella achalife toda nidava. Maybe it's a case where I don't. Now, the Mishnah, when it talked about bringing another animal when the one got lost, is obviously talking about harei alai, because only in a case where I took it upon myself as an obligation would I have to replace the animal. If it's a chalife toda nedava, and I said this animal will be a toda, I don't have to replace it. So if the animal got lost and I brought another animal supposedly in its stead, it's not really in its stead. It's actually what I'm really doing. In a second, we're going to call this marbeh b'todotu. I'm basically saying, okay, I promised animal number one, but then animal number one gets lost. So now I'm going to promise animal number two. In other words, I'm bringing a new korban toda. And then if I find animal one, well, I've now committed to bring this animal as a toda and that animal as a toda, and I have to bring them both, and I have to bring them both with bread. So therefore, bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, it doesn't matter whether I already then brought animal one before animal two, or whether I brought animal two before animal one. It doesn't make a difference. They're both te'unot lechem. They both need bread because I basically committed two separate korbanot todas, and that's what we call marbeh b'todotu. Marbeh means I gave more todot. I gave more than one. I promised more than one, and then each one would obviously need bread, and that can't be what Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying, because Rabbi Yochanan said only in the case of after kapara do I not bring bread, but before kapara, if I brought that one first, I would bring bread with it. Okay, next option. Ela avlad todat nedava. Maybe it's the offspring of a toda where I said this animal will be for nedava, will be for a toda, sorry. This animal will be a toda, and then it had an offspring, it had a baby. So, what would be the case here? El avlad todat nedava, well, bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, ein tunim lechem. Of course, the vlad doesn't need lechem because it's motar de todahu. It's just extra left over from the toda. In other words, the offspring is viewed as part of the animal, but now it's extra because now it was removed from the animal. It was born. So it's just extra stuff that's left over from our korban toda that we designated because we said this animal, so the vlad is just an extra, and that just has to be sacrificed, but of course it doesn't come with bread, and that wouldn't matter whether we sacrifice the vlad first or we sacrifice its mother first. Totally irrelevant. But we finally get to the answer now. Ela avlad todat chova. It's the vlad of a toda where I said harei alai, meaning I didn't say this animal. I said I'm bringing a korban toda. I'm going to bring a korban toda no matter what. Then I separate the animal, which was, let's say, assume pregnant. The animal now has an offspring, has a baby. And now we're going to learn something new that we didn't learn before. Now we're going to say exactly what Rabbi Yochanan said. It's going to fit perfectly. Why? Lifnei kapara, if we decide to sacrifice that vlad first, we bring it with bread. Okay, we're going to see why in a minute. And then we don't bring the mother with bread. La'achar kapara, ein telum lechem. But if we brought the mother first, then the vlad wouldn't need lechem. Now, my kamash malan, what's he teaching us? De kasava Rabbi Yochanan adam mitkaper b'shevach hekdesh. Rabbi Yochanan holds by this unique opinion that you could get atonement from something that came out of the hekdesh. In other words, let's say I designate an animal. Again, I designated first, I said, I have to bring something. So no matter what, I have to bring an animal, but not necessarily this one. Then I designate this one, so this one becomes the one. But now what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is I can either use this animal or I can use anything that came from that animal, like, for example, the offspring. So I could actually choose in that case, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Now, this wasn't clear in the Mishnah, but Rabbi Yochanan is saying he thinks that you could actually bring the vlad first in that case. And then if you brought the vlad first, that would be lifnei kapara, it would need to go with the bread because that would actually be your toda offering. And then the second one, right, the actual original animal in this case would come without the bread. Okay, so that's a unique halacha, and that's what Rav Chanina is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that he holds by this. That's section 1 of our Gemara. Now we're going to move to Shmuel. Shmuel is going to make this comparison, and we're going to see this in 2 sugyot today, between a korban chatat and a korban toda. Okay, we have to wonder a little bit why there's this comparison between the two. They're very different offerings, but somehow there seems to be a comparison. There must be some idea behind the comparison, but we're going to talk about how the comparison works. So there's a big famous thing about chatat. Okay, there's 5 chataot shemetot. That means there's 5 cases. The Rashi Tevot, to remember it, is vitimna. Okay, vav, taf, mem, nun, ayim. We're going to go through the cases in a minute. But vitimna means that these cases of vitimna, which is just a reference to it. Vitimna is that if you have certain situations, which are very similar to the ones in our Mishnah, we're going to see there's an overlap of 3 of them, that something, okay, either there's a vlad, that the chatat that I designated had an offspring. So let's spell it all out in that case, what it means, meta. It means that the vlad of an animal that I designated to be a sin offering, the offspring has to be left to die. There's nothing we could do with it. It's basically got a sanctity that there's no way to redeem it. So we leave it to die. Okay, it sounds like a pretty harsh thing, but that's the halacha. Okay, and there's 5 of them that we do this with. In the parallel case of an asham, for example, we've learned this before, ro'eh ad sheyista'ev, remember that terminology? We leave it to graze until it gets a blemish, and then we can redeem it because it has kedusha l'guf, right? It itself is sanctified, so the only way to redeem it is to wait till it can't be used as a sacrifice anymore, and then, which means it's blemished, and then you can redeem it. But in the case of the chatat, it's a halacha l'moshe misinai. Okay, we don't know why, but it's a basically passed down halacha for many generations, that these 5 are left to die. So there's the vlad, there's the tmura. Those were the 2 cases in our Mishnah that we had. Metu ba'aleha, this is unique for a chatat. This is not going to have a parallel in the Toda, because there is no such thing. I mean, there is, we'll talk about it, but metu ba'aleha means if I was supposed to bring a sin offering, I designate an animal and then I die, so no one can bring that sin offering in place of me because it's my atonement that I need. Now in a Toda, there's no parallel there, because if someone were to designate a Toda and then die, their offsprings, their heirs would bring it for them, because it's not a thing that I needed atonement or something like that. Nitkapru ba'aleha. This is the classic case we had in our Mishnah of if you lost it, then you brought a different one in its stead, and then you found the original one, well, or you found them both and then used the first one instead of the second one. So the one that's left over is one that basically the owners got atonement from some other sacrifice. The owner already got atonement for the other sacrifice, so the rejected one is left to die. And avrash nata, which is also not relevant in a Toda because there's no date limitation, but here the animal has to be a certain age. If it passes that age in a chatat, it's left to die because it can't be brought anymore. Like, these are all cases where there's nothing you can do. You can't, they have sanctity of a chatat, but you can't bring them as a chatat, so we have to leave them to die. Okay, comes Shmuel. That's all the background to Shmuel's statement. Shmuel says, Kol shebechatat meta, any of these 5 cases where in a chatat it's left to die, betoda ein tu'una lechem. If this happens in a Toda, okay, now, again, only 3 of them. The Vlad, this is basically our Mishnah, right? The Tmura, and Nitkapru ba'aleha. If they got atonement from the other one, then that one is left to be brought as a sacrifice, but without bread. Okay, so we have this parallel now. It's not a complete parallel. They're not left to die in the Toda case. They are sacrificed, but they come without bread. Okay, so far so good. Kol shebechatat ro'eh, but the second part of his statement is going to cause us a lot of trouble. If in a case of a chatat, it's left to graze, like I said with the asham, now we don't know what cases yet in a chatat graze, but if there's a case, or any time there's a case, that a chatat is left to graze and then can be redeemed after it gets a blemish, in the parallel case in a Toda, betoda tu'una lechem, it would come with bread. Okay, we don't know what this means. We're going to have to figure it out. And as we know what it means, we just don't know what the case is of roeh. But before we start to figure out roeh, Mativ Rav Amram comes now and brings a contradiction. And he says, and he's going to start with this brighta we saw at the end of yesterday's daf. Mahu omer, toda yakriv, minayin lemafrish. So why does it say toda yakriv? That word yakriv is coming to include something. Minayin lemafrish toda tov avda, Okay, this is to teach you the halacha in our Mishnah that if you took a toda and it got lost, and then you took another one in its place, you found the first one, and they're both standing before you. You choose whichever one you want and bring the bread. That's the expansion. You might have thought the second one needs bread. Okay, the basic premise here is this first one doesn't need, okay, now we're going to specifically talk about one case within this because there's two cases. Either I find the first and I bring the first, or I find the first and I still bring the second. So in the case where I find the first and I bring the second one, that's also discussed in that Braita, I sacrifice the second one. The first one is sacrificed without bread. Okay, so now what we basically have here is Toda Ein Tuna Lechem, and we're going to assume the parallel is in the Chatat Meta, right? So we're going to find a parallel case where we have a Chatat, which we designate an animal. It was lost, it was found, and then we end up sacrificing the second one. And we're going to see that according to the rabbis, in the first one is actually Roeh in that case. And then it's not going to fit this principle, because if it's Bechatat Roeh, then betoda it should need lechem, and this doesn't need lechem. That's basically where we're going. So let's read it inside. So now he says, utznan, ve'ilu gabe chatat ki agavna roeh. Okay, now he says, gabe chatat, in that similar parallel case, it's roeh. And that's what we're going to see right now, ditznan, as it says in the Mishnah. Hifrish chatatov avda. Okay, which again, we're going to see that it's roeh. And if it's roeh, we should need bread in the parallel case, and that's not the case. And then Shmuel doesn't make any sense. So Frish Katatov Avda, you designate a sin offering, it gets lost. Hifrish Acheret Tafta, you take a different one instead. Vinim Seit Harishona, and then you find the original one, Barishtem Umdod, it's the exact same thing, they're both before you. Mitzkaper Be'chamehem Ushniat Tamut Divrei Rebbe. Okay, Rebbe actually works fine, because Rebbe says, you choose whichever one you want, and the second one is left to die. And that would be perfect. Same thing as our Mishnah, choose whichever one you want, and the other one is brought without bread. Okay, and that works perfectly. Chatat Meita, and the Toda doesn't need bread. But the Chachamim say it depends on the scenario. Chachamim say it depends which one you sacrifice. It actually depends when you found the first one, okay? He says like this. Ein chatat meita ela shenimtzei la'achar shenitkapru ba'alim. The only time the chatat is left to die, now you have to think about why these chatots are left to die. They're left to die because you could kind of say like they were completely rejected in a certain way. So we're going to see right now. He says, the chatat's meta only if it was completely lost at the time you brought the second one. So I lost it. I then brought the second one, designated the second one, slaughtered and sacrificed the second one, and only later found the first. Then it's called a chatat shemetu ba'aleha. Now, what's the inference from this Mishnah? Right? It says it's only after you find it if you find it later. HaKodem shenitkapru ba'aleha, but if they're both standing before me because I found the original one that was lost, and now I have an option, one or the other, what would the assumption be from this Mishnah? That if I found it at that point and then just say, okay, I'm going to take the second one instead of the first, what's going to happen with the first? It's only going to be roeh. So the first one is roeh. And if it's roeh, then in the parallel case of the Toda, it should need bread, and that's definitely not what we said. Not in the Mishnah, and not certainly in the description in this Braita. So Shmuel's statement, Kosh b'chatat roeh, doesn't make any sense here according to what the rabbis say. So the easy answer is to say, Shmuel ki Rebbe svirale. Okay, so Shmuel holds like Rebbe, which is perfect. Amar, avuda b'shada frasha meta. If it's lost at the time you designated it, in other words, it's not based on the time that you sacrificed the other one. As long as it's lost when you designated number two, then number one, no matter what, is left to die. And as if you don't slaughter number one, then number one has to die. So if you say that, right, so that works, okay? Now, then that makes sense. That fits perfectly. But now we're going to have a problem with this, which is what? Well then, now remember what I said in the beginning. We don't really know when the chatat's roeh. So according to the rabbis, we came up with a case where the chatat was roeh. Now the problem with the rabbis is the chatat meta case didn't fit, right? In other words, the principle, kosher b'chatat roeh, but tudat tuna lechem didn't work because it actually doesn't need lechem in the parallel case. According to Rebbe, we're going to say, well, then what case is roeh according to Rebbe? Okay? Ela roeh, ela Rebbe, hechem mishkachala. Where are we going to have a case of roeh according to Rebbe? Because in this case, he thinks it's meta, maybe in all cases. So we're going to answer, although we're going to then have a problem with it. Kidi Rabbi Yoshaya, Da'amar Rabbi Yoshaya, הפריש שתי חטאות לאחריות, מתכפר באיזה מהם שירצה, בשנייה תראה. Now, if we talk about gradations of rejection, right? Before we started with Chachamim, we say, well, it's not going to die if it was found at the time that it was found before we sacrificed and we had two in front of us. Well, Rebbe doesn't agree. He thinks that's also kind of rejected and has to be left to die. But he does agree that if in the beginning, if I'm a little bit of an obsessive compulsive person or just a little nervous that something's going to happen and I want to be extra prepared, I bring two chata'ot from the beginning and I say, listen, just in case something happens to the first, here's the second one. And I have them both in front of me. Mitkaper be'ezeh mehem shiurtzeh v'ashniya tireh. In this case, Rebbe will agree with Rabbi Yoshaya, at least we're guessing, making an assumption here. The Rebbe will agree with Rabbi Yoshaya, then in that case, it's roeh only. It doesn't need to be left to die, because again, it's less rejected anyway than before, because you're basically saying, I know from the beginning that one of these won't be used. So that's not so rejected that we're going to leave it to die. Okay, so that would be the case. What's the problem? Well, then it has to fit into Shmuel's principle. If we're reading Shmuel according to Rebbe, then Rebbe's going to say, in that parallel case, kol shebechatat roeh, if I did shtayim lachrayut, then in a toda, both would bring bread. Is that true? Completely not. If I say, I'm not sure something's going to happen to this animal, so here are two animals. Now, in the end, I might have to bring the second animal as a sacrifice, but I certainly don't bring them both with bread. They're not both my toda. One was just in waiting in case something happened to it. So that's a problem, right? Hagabe toda ki agavne ein tuna lechet. Definitely doesn't need bread in this case. And then it doesn't fit into the principle, kol shebechatat roeh b'toda tuna lechem. And then Shmuel doesn't make any sense again. So we're back to square one. We don't know how Shmuel works. Who he's talking according to. We have this contradiction. So the Gemara answers, Shmuel, Ela Shmuel ki Rabbi Shimon Sfira. Shmuel holds by some other opinion. We had Rebbe and Chachamim, right? Chachamim who had the most, right? Roeh can be even in more cases. We had Rebbe who limited Roeh to this one case of Rabbi Yoshaya. And now we're going to have Shmuel who says, Chamesh chatot metot. They're always dying. They're always going to be left to die. Okay, what he means, all the chamesh chatot metot, what he means is nitkapru ba'aleha, right? All these cases that we've been talking about, where is it roeh, is it not roeh, is it meta, are all variations of nitkapru ba'aleha, because in the end, it's one sacrifice that you already got atonement for, and now you have another one that was designated. Either it was designated because it was lost, or it was designated because you put them both together from the beginning for achrayut. Okay, we came up with cases of roeh. According to Rabbi Shimon, none of those cases are going to be roeh. They're all made to. And then we don't have this problem of, that case is roeh, and yet in the Toda it's not tuna lechem, and that doesn't fit in with Shmuel's principle, so we're in good shape. Except what's the problem? The obvious problem is, Elevahar roeh Rabbi Shimon late klal. That can't work though, because we're trying to figure out, okay, so we got that Shmuel fits like Rabbi Shimon, and that resolved the contradiction, the problem with the line, because we know the cases we brought so far of roeh, the Toda doesn't need bread, and that wouldn't work. But the problem is Rabbi Shimon actually has no cases of roeh. So how could Shmuel hold like Rabbi Shimon and say, well, if it's meita and a chatat, the Toda doesn't need bread. If it's roeh, the Toda does need bread. There is no case of roeh. So that second line of Shmuel would make no sense. So what are we going to answer? Shmuel nami chada kamar. Kol shebechatat meita b'toda ein tuna lechem. We're basically going to erase this line. Okay, we're going to make an X through that line. Kol shebechatat roeh b'toda tuna lechem. He never said. Shmuel just said, if it's meita and the chatat, in the Toda, it doesn't need bread, and he holds like Rabbi Shimon across the board. All the cases where we already designated a different animal, where we have two animals for the same sacrifice, and we bring one, the second one will be sacrificed, but not with bread. And that fits actually very nicely, except that we had to edit what we said Shmuel said. It's the downside. Okay, now, they want to know, my kamash malam. Okay, but what's his chiddush? We probably could have figured that out on our own, because we know all the cases of the Toda doesn't need bread. And this goes back to something we learned earlier. He was trying to teach us that in the 5 cases of chatat meta, and he was specifically focusing on the vlad, no matter what, right? The vlad and the chatat is always meta. You can never bring that instead of the original animal. Also in a toda, you can never bring it as the toda, and it never gets brought with bread. And that goes against Rabbi Yochanan, who actually said in the end of this previous section, right? The whole thing was to teach you, this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, we in the end understood to teach you that you could use the vlad instead. So if you bring the vlad before the mother, it would need bread. And basically Shmuel's coming to say, I disagree with that. Okay? So what we basically, in a real nutshell, what we did so far in the sugya was, we basically showed that what Rabbi Yochanan says, the main point he was making was Adam mitkaper b'shevach hektesh, and the main point Shmuel is making is Adam lo mitkaper b'shevach hektesh. Okay, that in the end is what we learned so far in this stuff. Okay, now we're going to go to the next chart at the bottom of the first side of the study guide, which we're going to have a few different cases where the owner of the korban either said something or did something, and we're going to see the relationship between the bread and the animal. Okay, right now we've been focused on the bread, and why is that? Because we're in Masechet Menachot. But the real toda, right, the main part of the toda, is actually the animal sacrifice, which we discussed in Masechet Tzvachim. So I'm a Rabbi Abba. If you say, Zo toda v'zo lachma, this is a toda and this is its bread. Here's an animal and this is the bread for the animal. Avad halechem mivi lechem acher. If the bread gets lost, so you just bring different bread to go along with that toda. But avdat toda, if you lost the animal and you said, this is the animal and this is its bread, and you lose the animal, eino mivi toda acheret. You don't bring another toda, another animal to replace so you could bring that lechem. In other words, the lechem just goes to waste and you don't replace that animal with another animal. My time, what's the reason? Lechem liglal toda ve'ein toda liglal lechem. Okay, liglal is like the word biglal. The lechem comes on the account of the toda, and this is kind of putting it all in its place. The lechem, the central part really is the toda. The bread just comes because of the toda. So if you lose the bread, you just bring other bread in its place. But the bread, the ein toda liglal lechem, you don't say, oh, the bread is the main thing and we're bringing the animal because of the bread. And therefore, if you said this is a toda, this is its bread, and you lose the toda, you just bring another animal and bring it to go with that bread. No, you don't. You start from scratch, okay? That's different. Okay, we don't, and this is the relationship between them. It's showing the relationship. And the same with the next two cases. Amar Rava, okay, that was Rabbi Abba. Now Rava makes a statement. This is the same idea. Amar Rava, hifrish ma'ot l'toda tov. You designated money for a toda. Let's say you designate $100 to buy an animal, and you said it's for a toda, vini totru, turning out I'm a bet, and you had some left over. It only cost you $90, so you have $10 left over. What can you do with that money? Maybe behem lechem. Since the lechem comes on account of the toda, right? Same kind of idea, although we're going to see it inside a little differently, but you can use that rest of that money for the bread. But lilachmei todavini totru, if I said I'm bringing $100 to go buy, or maybe $20 or maybe more, it's a lot of bread, to go buy all those breads, and you have some leftover money. There was a sale in the bakery and you got it for cheaper and it was left over. Ein mivi behem toda. You can't use the leftover money for the animal. My time. Well, what's the reason? Ilema, if you're going to say Mishum Rav Kahana, de Rav Kahana, because of what Rav Kahana says. De Amar Rav Kahana, Minayin lelachmei toda shenikru toda. How do you know that the breads of the toda are also called toda, which would then work, because if you designated ma'ot for your toda, well, toda includes the bread. How do we know this? Shenema, v'ikriv al zevach hatoda chalot matzot. And because they say the zevach hatoda, you did for the zevach hatoda chalot. So it sounds like the chalot are for the toda. So you could say lechem ikre toda. Okay, from there you see the bread is called toda. Now, if you want to say that, ihachi ibchanami. But if you're going to say it's all because of Rav Kahana, then you could say the exact opposite as well, which is what? You could say maybe the bread, that the toda is called bread. In other words, this seems to put together the zevach hatoda with the chalot matzot as if they're interchangeable. So you can't really say it's Rav Kahana because that wouldn't work. But they say, no, it actually does work. Because from that pasuk, what do you learn? Lechem ikre toda. The bread is called toda, but toda lo ikre lechem. But the word toda doesn't, the korban toda, the animal, is definitely never called bread. You would never call the animal bread. That doesn't make sense. But you could call the bread toda. And that's why it only works in one direction and not in the other. Okay, v'amar Rav. Now we're going to go back to this comparison between a toda and a chatat. Okay, we're going to start with the case of a toda. We're going to see a machlok at Rav and Abaye. And then Rabbi Zera is going to say it's the same thing for chataot. Okay, so this is kind of going back to a bunch of things we saw in today's daf, because we're going to have a case where something gets lost and you bring another animal in its stead. And then we're going to see the same thing for a toda and the parallel for the chatat, again being, does it come with bread or without bread, and does it die or not die? Okay, it's going to be the same comparison that Shmuel made, which is if it's a case where the chatat's meta, then the toda doesn't need bread. Okay, so let's go through our cases. Hifrish todato ve'avda. So now it's like we saw before. I designate an animal for a toda and it gets lost. V'chazar, and I said harei alai, I have to bring, so I now bring another one. Chazar v'ifrish acheret tachta, I brought another one in its stead. But before I sacrifice it, avda. Now this case is going to get more than the previous cases. I now lost the second one. V'chazar v'ifrish acheret tachta, and then I brought a third one. V'nimtzu rishonot, and then I find the two originals. So now I have three. Harei shlosh tanum dot. I have three animals before me. And now we're going to have three possibilities about what I could do. Either I use the first one to get my sacrifice, right, to do my sacrifice, or I use the third one, or I use the second one. Okay, we're going to see why we go in the order of 1, 3, and 2. It'll be clear in a minute. So here goes. Nitkapir barishona, and then we're going to say, what if? Okay, you can obviously use any one of the three, just like we saw before. But if I use the first one, okay, so obviously then I bring the first one as my toda, I bring it with bread, all good. What do I do with the second and the third? Shnia enatuna lechem. Okay, the shnia is a classic case of chalifei toda. The second was in place of the first. So I bring it without bread because I brought the first instead. And now the second one I just bring without bread. But shlishi tuna lechem. Comes Rava and says the third one needs bread. Why does the third one need bread? Because the third one is replacing the second one. But the second one, in the end, was not a toda, because in the end, I used the first one. So this third, according to Rava, is not viewed as a replacement of the first, even though theoretically it really was, because I only brought it because I originally committed to the first. Then I lost it. I brought the second. Then I lost the second. I brought the third. But he says this third is really coming because I lost the second one. And in the end, the second one went without bread. So the second one wasn't a toda. So it's not a chalifei toda. A chalifei toda doesn't come with bread. But the third one is viewed as what? It's a term we used earlier in the daf. I'll scroll up to show you where we used it. If you remember in the very beginning, we said, marbeh betodot. If I said a rezo and I really don't have to bring a replacement, and I bring another one to replace it, it's just viewed as an extra korban toda. So it's as if I committed 2 korbanot todas. And that's the way he views this third one, and the third one needs bread. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing in the reverse. Nitkaper b'shlishit. If in the end I use the third animal, then shnia enatuna lechem, because the shnia is the third one was replacing the second one. In the end, the third one got brought, so the second doesn't eat bread. But the rishonah tuna lechem, because again, the third and the first have nothing to do with each other. In the end, the toda was in the third. So the first is just another korban toda, and therefore it comes with bread. That's why those two came first. Nitkaper be'emtzai, but if in the end you use the second one, well, since the second one is, right, the first one was replacing the second, and the third was replacing the second, so neither needs bread. Okay, there's a siren going off, so I'm going to pause, and we will come back soon. Sorry about that. Pause this. Okay, I'm back. We will get started again. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, so then we basically have Rava saying, if we were just to review, Nitkaper b'rishonah and Nitkaper b'shlishi, we have those two different cases. We basically said the first one and the third one are not connected to each other, and therefore, if the first one's brought, the third one needs bread. If the third one's brought, the first one needs bread. Second one, no matter what, won't need bread. And if you actually get atonement from the middle one, then neither the first nor the third are going to need bread, because again, the second one is the replacement for the first, and the third was the replacement for the second. So in both those cases, like that was like the first case in our Mishnah. If you brought one, then the other one doesn't matter which one. Now, Abaye disagrees. Abaye Amar, which I think we would think is more intuitive, at least I thought so. It doesn't matter. In the end, obviously, the third is replacing the first also. And therefore, whichever one, first, second, third, it doesn't matter. None of the others come with bread. Okay, that was the first machloka between Rava and Abaye. Comes Rabbi Zera and he says, Amar Rabbi Zera, v'chein l'inyan chataot. By the way, the same thing is true for chatat. Again, going back to our comparison, if in the chatat is meta, then the toad is not going to need bread. And even though we kind of deleted this line, it's also going to be, we are going to find a case of kol shebechatat ro'eh b'toda te'una lechem. If in the chata case it doesn't, it's not meta, then the toda will need bread. So let's see. Hifrish, we're going to have the exact same thing, so let's do a review of what we just said. Hifrish chatato v'avda. You designated a sin offering and it got lost. Hifrish acheret tachta v'avda. And then you replaced it with another one, and that one got lost as well. And then hifrish acheret tachta, and then you brought a third to replace the second one. V'nimtzua rishonot, and then before you sacrifice any of them, you find all three. V'aresh shlosh tanum dot, and they're all before you. So, nitkaper b'rishona. So Rava says, Rava Amar, nitkaper b'rishona. If you get atonement from the first, shnia tamut, and shlishit tir'eh. So the second one is going to die, and the third one will be left to graze. Here you see again, if you use the first, the third one's going to be left to graze. It's not considered that you brought the first instead of the third, right? Those are totally unconnected, and therefore it's not as bad. And therefore, we're going to leave it to graze. In other words, it's not as bad, meaning it's not like you had these two, this one was in place of that one, and then there's nothing you could do with that other one, it has to die, because that third one wasn't really in place of the first one at all, and therefore it's left to graze. In the end, it was replacing a second one, which wasn't anything in the end, because the second one we didn't use. Nitkaper b'shlishit, and again, the third one, well then shniyat tamud and rishonat tireh, the reverse. You use the third, then the first one is left to graze. Only the second one is left to die. Nitkaper b'emtzeit shtehen yamutu, and obviously if you use the middle one, both are going to be left to die. And then again comes Abai Amal, afilu nitkaper be'echad mehem shtehem yamutu kulan chalipin da'adadin. We view each as a replacement of the other, and all have to be left to die. So now they just ask, my v'chein, why did Rabbi Zera have to tell us this is also true for chato? Why wouldn't it just be intuitively obvious? Well, Ma'u Detema, you might have thought, now, what was the whole premise of the Toda? Well, you can be Marbebe Todot, right? You can bring as many Todot as you want, Thanksgiving offerings. So when we have this extra one that's not really connected to anything, we'll bring it with bread, because it's just saying you really just meant to bring an extra Toda. Or it's like that. It's not really that was what you were intending, but we can view it as part of that. But in a chata case, you can't say we can bring extra chataot, so maybe the same principle wouldn't apply. Kamash malan, that's where Rabbi Zera says, no, the same principle applies by chatat as well. Okay, now we're going to begin our last sugya of today's daf. Now this sugya is a quite complicated sugya. It continues well into tomorrow's daf. I made a huge chart for tomorrow, so I recommend if you're going to learn on the Chag, print it before Chag, and you'll have a sheet to help guide you through the sugya. This bottom chart on our page is just kind of the beginning of the chart that's going to develop tomorrow. There's 8 possibilities. Today we're going to get to 3, okay, but we'll see in a minute what it's about. So Tani Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia brings a braita that says, Toda shenit arva b'tmurata. Okay, we had a Toda and we had a Tmura. So basically what happened? I designated an animal for Korban Toda, and I said, you know what, instead of this animal, I want to bring a different one, which I'm not allowed to do. Goes against Torah law, but in the end, both are sanctified and I have to sacrifice them both. What did we learn already? Toda comes with 40 loaves, Tmura comes with no bread at all. In this case, though, we got mixed up, and we didn't remember which was which doesn't really matter, because if we don't know which is which, we bring them both, and we bring bread, and we say whichever one is the Toda, the bread goes with it. But in our case, it got a little more complicated because meta echad mehem, but one of them died. And now we don't know which one's the Toda, which one's the Tmura. Is the live one the Toda? Is the live one the Tmura? Comes this braita that Rabbi Chia brings, and it says, Chavirta ein la takana. There's nothing you could do with that animal. It's stuck. Stuck in nowhere's land. Why? Because what are we supposed to do? Nakriv lechem bahadav. We're going to bring lechem with it till Tmurahi. Maybe it's a Tmura, and Tmura you're not allowed to bring bread, right? Not only do you not bring bread, but then the bread is useless, right? You're bringing chulin to the Azarah. You're not allowed to bring things that are not meant to be there. Lo nakriv lechem bahada. If we don't bring lechem with it, well, maybe don't todahi. Maybe it's the Toda, and then it needs bread, and you can't bring a Toda without the bread. So you're stuck. That's what he says. Okay, now before we get to the chart, we have one more thing in the Gemara, which I didn't bring on the chart. Now the Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case here? And we're going to go back to Hare Alai, Hare Zeh. Remember, Hare Alai means I take responsibility. Hare Zo, I don't assume responsibility. Ida Amar Hare Alai, Lo Sagid Lo Maite. You can't not do anything if you said Hare Alai. If you said Hare Alai, you basically assumed responsibility. That means you have to replace it with another animal. So in other words, maybe it's the tamura, and maybe your animal died, your toda, so you have to replace it. So what do? There is a sakana if it's harei alai. Leite behema achrina v'lechem v'lema. Bring another animal with bread and say the following. Ihachtekayma tamurahi. If right, so you basically make a t'nai, a stipulation. If the original one was tamura, then great. Hatoda v'halachma. I brought bread, I brought an animal, I'm just bringing a new korban toda to replace my original that I have to replace. Ihachtekayma todahi. If the one that was originally there is a toda, then halachma v'hatehavi achrayut. Then, if the original one that died if the one that's still alive is the toda, then here's the bread for the toda, and this one will just be ba'achrayut. This is what we saw in the Mishnah, chalipin. It'll just be a replacement of that one, and that one comes without bread. So we're in good shape. What's the problem? Well, Rabbi Chia brought it in a case, Lotzricha de'amar harezo. Now, in a case of harezo, there is no chalipin that's supposed to be brought as a korban. It doesn't work that way because I don't have to replace it. So there is no replacement korban. And then I have no way really to bring it. Now, here's a siman. I'm not going to read the siman, but a siman is the way to remember who said and what they said. Okay, that's why it's a long siman, and there's 8 difficulties on Rabbi Chia saying, well, why can't you do this? Like, we have solutions, okay? And each time we're going to explain why it's not a good solution. So the first 3 are brought by what's called Lemedin Lefnei Rebbe, those who were learning before Rebbe, but it's really known to be it's Levi. Okay, Levi brings the first 3 suggestions. Amru Lemedin Lefnei Rebbe, v'leite lechem, why don't you just bring bread and say, if the one that's still alive is a toda, great, here's the bread. And then you just, right, that's it. You just bring the bread with the toda and you're done. Elo, if not, we'll just say, oh, we brought some random bread to the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, now the obvious problem here is Amar Lahu, Rebbe said to him, you can't bring chulin into the Azarat. This is, by the way, Lamedim said it before Rebbe. In other words, Levi said it before Rebbe. He suggested a way to resolve Rabbi Chia's problem. And Rebbe says to him, you can't bring chulin into the Azarat. If you're not supposed to bring the breads, you can't just bring the breads into the temple and sort of do a service with them. You can't do that. So that doesn't work. Next. Amar Lahu, sorry, no, I skipped. Sorry, I just lost my place for a second. Okay. V'leite behema v'lechem. Why don't you bring a second animal? There's 3 animals. There's one that died, there's one that's left, and now we're going to bring another animal with bread. So we're going to have in the end 2 animals and the loaves of bread. V'lema, and you stipulate the following. Ihachtekayma tmurahi. If the one that's still alive is a tmura, okay, then the second animal, hatoda v'halachma. Okay, if the one that's alive is a tmura, then great. This new animal is just a korban toda, and here's the bread with it. It's like a new korban toda that I'm bringing. Okay? Ihachtekayma todahi, and if the one that's still alive is a toda, then halachma, then here's the bread for it. And what about the new animal I just brought? Tahavi shlamim. We'll just say the second bread is a voluntary shlamim offering, which doesn't come with bread. That sounds perfect. Amar lehu mishum dekamemai ba'achila deshlamim. No, you can't do that because you're limiting the amount of time that you can eat a shlamim. Remember, a shlamim can be eaten 2 days and a night. The toda can only be eaten 1 day and 1 night. So you're limiting, if it really is a shlamim, which it's a possibility, we don't know, it's either a toda or it's a shlamim, well, you have to treat it the more severe and eat it in that short, limited time. And you're basically limiting the amount of time the shlamim can be eaten. And we don't like to do that. We've seen this before. Because then it creates more opportunities of things to become notar and disqualified and have to be burned, and we don't like to do that. Okay, next. Amar Levi LeRebbe. So this is still the Lemedim before Rebbe, because this is Levi, as we said. He says, 3rd suggestion, V'leite behema v'lechem v'lema. So same thing, bring another animal and bread, but say the following stipulation. He's changing the stipulation a little bit. It's don't make the second shlamim, make the second something else, okay? Ihachtekayma tmurihi hatoda v'halachma. Okay, so first of all, this is the same as before. If you said that for one that's allowed is tamura, great. Now we just bring a new behema, a new lechem, we have a new korban toda that I'm bringing. If the one that's still alive is a toda, halachma v'hatehave motar de toda. Why don't you just call the second one leftover toda? Okay, so the bread goes with the animal, the first one, which was your toda, and the second one is just called, this became your leftover toda. To which Amar le, we'll end with this line. Rebbe says this guy really looks like he has no brains in his head. What is motar? Motar is if we're left with something, not because we tried to do it, right? It just happened that way. You can't intentionally say this will be left over, like intentional leftover. There's no such thing. So that doesn't work. Okay, with that, we're going to stop for today. We'll go back here when we start in tomorrow's daf. Okay, so what did we do today? We'll kind of use the study guide to do our quick review. We started with these 4 suggestions about how to understand the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, which in the end we basically said Rabbi Yochanan holds you could be mitkaper b'shevach hekdesh, and therefore the vlad of a harei alai offering, since you have to replace it, since you have to give it, if you choose the vlad over the animal, you could, and that can be brought with bread, as long as you bring the vlad first. Okay, and then the other one we brought without bread, the original animal, and that's what he says. In the end, after seeing this whole statement of Shmuel, we ended up concluding, after we had this contradiction of Shmuel's statement by comparing the Toda and the Chatat, we end up saying that Shmuel basically says the exact opposite of Rabbi Yochanan, that Adam lo mitkaper b'shevach kli, v'shevach hekdesh. You can't use the vlad, and that was his whole point about saying kosh b'chatat meta b'toda ein tuna lechem. There's no way you would ever bring bread with a vlad of a Toda. Okay, and that's because he holds like Rabbi Shimon in the end, who says all the chatot are all metot. We had that whole long thing about how to figure out what Shmuel was saying. Then we had these cases of Rabbi Abba and Rabba who brought cases of the Toda and the Lechem and the relationship between the two, that the Toda can't be called bread, but the bread can be called Toda. And then we got to the cases of Rav and Abai where they had this disagreement with 3 animals that you replaced, both in the Chatat and in the Toda. And we saw again that comparison that Shmuel made, and basically, are the first and the third connected or are they not connected? And then, and therefore that would they be like an extra toda and brought with bread, and in the chata case only be roet, or would they all be meta, and would you have to not bring any of them with bread? Okay, then we had this Rabbi Chia, this brighty he brought about having a situation where we have no solution to the problem, and we explain why there's no solution, but then Levi, and then we're going to see other people try to suggest possible solutions to the problem, and for that, like I said, we'll have a big chart tomorrow, and we'll review it also starting from the beginning of tomorrow's daf. With that, wishing everyone a Chag Sameach. Like I said from the beginning, may it be a Chag of peace, to bring in peace and Besorot Tovot.
Amen.